Glory to Ukraine, glory to the defense forces, and the death of the enemy. My name is Fakhrudin Sharafmal, and I'm on the phone with legal analyst Andriy Vihirinsky to discuss important topics. Andriy, it's good to see you. We are closing our news week with the same topics that are taking on new colors. Let's start with Olaf Scholz, who rejected the idea of inviting Ukraine to join NATO, which is a key point in President Volodymyr Zelensky's plan. Scholz said, "A country at war cannot become a NATO member. Invitations are usually quickly linked to membership, and I will not change my position." So, it turns out that our plan for victory collapsed at the very beginning. The first key point, the most clear position, that there will be no membership, and this position is unchanged. I associate this immutability of the position, at least, maybe not immutability, but the firmness of this position. Just like in the issue of the towers, when everyone is absolutely pressing. And Scholz says, look, my position is unchanged, there will be no Tauruses. And here he has a similar position. You know how we could come to this conclusion, just analytically. But will it change the state policy in terms of abandoning the victory plan? The answer to this question is no, it won't, because the plan has been given a certain amount of time. According to the Associated Press, I think it's 3 months, according to Mr. Poroshenko. What are the possible forms of interpretation of the events at the front in a year's time? In a year, Putin will probably not be ready for diplomatic maneuvers to resolve the conflict. So we have an answer that has been emerging for the past 2 weeks. From the moment the details of the victory plan, in particular the first point, were announced to the public or discussed in the press, we have had representatives of the North Atlantic Alliance visiting us constantly. Not the leaders of the country, but representatives of the military command or representatives of, say, the administrative apparatus of the government. And they say, well, we are not expanding yet, this issue is not on the agenda yet, there is no consensus. That is, there seems to have already been a reaction, and it was negative. But then there was an article in one of the publications that said that NATO has at least 7 adversaries. And then Mr. Nikiforov came out and said, look, this is not entirely true. Those who suggested adversaries, we are working with them. But this does not mean that there are 7. Maybe there are 6, maybe there are 5, or maybe only 1 is enough.
Не знаємо про 6, про 7, умовно, а знаємо про те, що наша позиція незмінна, вона консолідована в межах всіх учасників НАТО.
Scholz's response to Mr. Nikiforov reflects the position of the President's office. Our position is unchanged and consolidated in NATO. As long as the country is at war, an invitation to membership is not possible. He noted that although membership would not be accepted during the war, the invitation was still considered an important point of the plan.
Тому запрошення – це ж теж, начебто, пункт плану. Нам достатньо запрошення. Тому по запрошенню ви нам ще ні не сказали.
So you have not yet told us about the invitation to join, which means that we remain adherents of this plan, or is this a form of a generally calculated policy that can lead to an invitation? It is a form of preserving the narrative of a victory plan that has not yet been rejected and leads to a positive outcome. It is a media and information narrative that supports the moral and psychological state of Ukrainians. The military political leadership may consider its behavior toward the Ukrainian population to be correct, as no alternative option has been developed or voiced. The president already seems to have named a resilience plan, although whether it is a strengthening plan is not entirely clear. That is, we are already, to a certain extent, beginning to take measures to defocus the attention of citizens around what is probably the third plan. The third is the first peace plan, the second is the victory plan, and the third is the plan that deals with internal Ukrainian strength, resilience, and so on. But, by and large, putting aside all the other things, let's say PR, political technologies, and information technologies, the question of membership, the question of invitation, is not on the agenda of the Atlantic Alliance countries, in my opinion. We have no information that Rutte is convening NATO leaders to decide on invitations or membership. There is no information about an extraordinary meeting of the alliance leaders or a change in the position of Hungary, Slovakia, Spain, or Germany. We remain in a situation where we have not been told no. Okay, well, I just don't know what no should look like. I was going to ask you about this. You've already partially touched on it. It's the fact that the policy says that 7 countries are against Ukraine's membership in the North Atlantic Alliance. In addition to Germany and the United States, there are 5 more countries, including Slovakia, Hungary, and a certain list of other countries. But, as already noted, the OP comes out and says, look, we deny and generally refute this information, given the previous question about Olaf Scholz and his answer. Why are we trying to give out wishful thinking? I realize that this may be a bit of a philosophical question, but we have already discussed the fact that a lot of information is presented in a way that we expect, not in a way that we can rely on. All our hopes are shattered like asphalt. It only gets worse or neutral. We do not talk about the positive, but only about the reality we live in. This is a practical issue, and we try to discuss it in accordance with the law, taking into account the mood of the Ukrainian audience. However, rational arguments do not work, because 98% of the information space discusses slogans and wishful thinking rather than facts.
Бо масовий, допустим, 98% решта інформаційного простору знаходиться в ключі обговорення не раціональних аргументів і фактів, а, скажімо, гасел і бажаного.
Mr. Nikiforov, a representative of the President's office, denied this information.
В якій частині вони її спростували?
It's also a simple, normal question. They did not confirm the list of countries, but said they were working with those who do not support the decision, which suggests that not everyone is in favor. Some leaders have already spoken out against the decision.
Значить, тоді в чому спростування? В тому, що всі за? Та ні, виходить, раз ви працюєте з тими, хто проти, то, напевно, не всі за. Більше того, частина лідерів вже і так сказали, що вони проти відповідного рішення. Фіцо і Орбан про це заявили прямо. Їм не треба ховатися за...
Fico and Orban have made their position clear, not hiding behind other NATO countries that hold even more radical views. Even Scholz came out and said the same thing. Well, you can interpret his words in this way. Yes, so what if they refuted it? We spoke out emotionally about the publication because we are outraged by this wording. But this wording, does it correspond to, actual reality, or does it not? I did not hear a refutation, but we were not satisfied with the wording. We refute the media narratives, but not with facts, but with disagreement, which is not a real refutation. Over the past 10 years, Ukrainian society has been cultivating the idea that the only way to ensure security is to...
Бо українське суспільство є, скажімо, протягом останніх 10 років, щонайменше, скажімо, об'єктом культивації думки про те, що
is Ukraine's membership in NATO.
спосіб забезпечення безпеки є членство України в НАТО.
This opinion has been cultivated without taking into account historical events and the positions of the countries deciding on NATO membership.
приймають рішення щодо членства в НАТО.
We convinced ourselves, in part, thanks to the previous political elite, which amended 3 articles of the Constitution. Our will is enough to become a member of NATO. Today, this will exists, and no political force in the parliament opposes it. No need. In membership referendums, as recent polls show that 70 to 80% of Ukrainians are ready to vote for joining NATO and the EU. There are really no questions. Petro Oleksievich can say that he was a visionary, and everyone agrees with him, Zelensky, Tymoshenko, and Boyko. But have we gotten any closer to NATO? No, we have not. The question of membership is not about internal unity or political position, but about the willingness of countries to assess the risks and accept us into NATO. These risks have not been discussed during the cultivation of the idea of NATO in Ukrainian society. If you haven't taught people to think in terms of the interests of other countries, then today people are not able to think in these categories by default. Therefore, when there are explanations or reports that, for example, Scholz is against it, the average Ukrainian says, well, it won't be Scholz, it will be Merz after him, and before him there was Merkel. But for some reason, Merkel, Scholz, and then Merz have the same position on this issue. And it does not depend on whether he is a man or a woman, whether he is a representative of the Social Democrats or the Christian Socialists. The issue is that Germany, in the event of hostilities on EU territory, will bear the burden of military costs, human, financial, and military. They do not want this. And if we look at the situation from this point of view, show me a politician, for example, Annalena Baerbock, who is radically pro-Ukrainian and a friend of former Foreign Minister Kuleba, who says Germany is ready to stand by Ukraine. There are no such statements. It speaks of support, effort, consolidation, that more determination, power, etc. are needed. Well, but all this determination, power, and so on rests on what is the ceiling of Ukraine's capabilities. The ceiling of Ukraine's capabilities is the human potential and the ability of the socio-economic system to withstand war. And it does have its limits. These limits are also not discussed in the Ukrainian information space from the point of view of political elites. And when we reach these limits, we will have to decide whether our partners will join the fight on our side or whether they will become participants in the war.
Тому й тягар відповідальності за рішення, пов'язані із припиненням війни, вступом в переговори і так далі, і тому подібне, завжди буде знаходитись на стороні України. А для того, щоб партнери завжди могли сказати, ми підтримували стільки, скільки могли. І стільки, скільки, власне,
Their position is that they are doing everything they can to avoid becoming participants. So the burden of responsibility for decisions related to ending the war, entering into negotiations, etc., will always be on Ukraine's side. This allows the partners to say, we have done as much as we can. At first it was as much as necessary, then as much as we could, and finally, Ukraine made the decision. And this is not some kind of classified information. American analysts talk about it, even in interviews on Ukrainian YouTube channels. For example, Samuel Harap, a corporate analyst, said on one of these channels that the United States and European partners will not make decisions for Ukraine to end hostilities, although they can create the conditions under which decisions will have to be made. Even if Ukraine does not accept them, it does not mean that they will go to war to avoid risks. That is why we return to the question of why we remain adherents of the NATO concept, despite the fact that the objective reality shows that we will not get membership or even the map. We are not working on other options, either in the information field or in public policy, because any other option would be perceived as a sign of weakness or capitulation. At the same time, by remaining adherents of this plan, we are not winning either. By the way, yesterday, the Razumkov Center released a poll showing that more than 30% of Ukrainians support negotiations with Russia, which is several percentage points more than similar polls a few months ago. This time, it is 37%, a growing share of people who are ready to negotiate. Can this be considered a preparation for considering another scenario for ending the hostilities, other than joining NATO? You can if, appealing to opinions and sociology serves as a tool to avoid responsibility. It is not necessary to wait until society has fully felt the burden of war to start negotiations. People who used to be against negotiations may change their position today, reflecting their transformation.
Соціологу відповідало декілька років про те, що ніяких переговорів. Сьогодні відповідь про те, що в принципі вже можна, це ж є теж.
This is a transformation that is associated with the fact that it is becoming, to put it mildly, unpleasant, difficult, threatening, and perhaps even insufficiently optimistic in terms of faith in the final positive outcome. Was it possible to foresee such consequences? Yes, it was possible. Or maybe, given the full information about the losses and the state of supply of the armed forces, to make a forecast of social consequences for the political leadership. It is necessary to avoid a situation where sociology reaches 50+1% to start communicating with the aggressor about the cessation of hostilities. The cessation of hostilities, the end of the war, and peace are different concepts that can be extended in time.
Поняття припинення бойових дій, припинення війни і мир. Це абсолютно різні речі, які можуть бути.
Both the cessation and negotiations on the cessation of hostilities do not mean peace agreements or legal fixation of the results of the war. These are different things. However, again, such a structure has not yet been built in the minds of Ukrainians, because a completely different idea is being cultivated. Negotiations. Surrender. Again, I'm trying to appeal to reason, realizing that this is difficult to do in our society. The Russian delegation came to the negotiations with capitulatory demands. Ukrainian diplomacy has achieved better and higher results for Ukraine. To see this, it is enough to spend time reading the documents from the Istanbul Communique or the draft treaty published by the New York Times instead of reading posts by former attorneys general without legal education. People tend to live in the interpretation of information rather than in its independent cognition, and this is a disaster in reality. Interpretation always has a subjective bias, and facts sometimes make you think about how you used to think or what categories you used to operate with in the past. Therefore, when we talk about changing sociology, it happens in view of reality, and the mood changes in accordance with it. This reality, which is reflected in sociology, shows that some Ukrainians are not too optimistic about the course of hostilities, the level of diplomatic support, and Ukraine's ability to achieve a positive result for itself. I won't say negative, but not optimistic enough. So, from the point of view of preserving their lives, the lives of their loved ones, and everything that is called Ukraine within those limits, in its economic and international subjectivity, these people believe that it is reasonable to consider resolving the hostilities through diplomacy. This position can be supported or ignored. I remember very well the period of the Istanbul negotiations, even before the summit, that is, before the document that was signed in Istanbul. Every week, sociological surveys were released showing a decline in Ukrainian support for joining NATO. This created the impression that before the signing of the agreements, the level of support could have fallen below the number of those opposed to integration. But against the backdrop of victories, or against the backdrop of the displacement of Russian troops from Kyiv, Kherson, and Kharkiv regions, our sociology has begun to show a completely different result. Now, against the backdrop of systematic messages that NATO is not so eager to have us, perhaps Ukrainians will indeed change their understanding and attitude towards the North Atlantic Alliance. For those who have forgotten, in February and March, we begged our partner countries to close the airspace over Ukraine. We begged them to help us. Aid did not arrive in early February, causing disappointment and changes in social perceptions. Disappointment with our partners' behavior may influence our actions. Whether we are forming the right attitudes toward those we seek to integrate into the EU. Another component of the sociological survey published on the pages of Ukrainska Pravda is also significant for the mood of Ukrainians. When 30% of Ukrainians know who to vote for to change the country, and the rest are undecided, it's a terrible picture. 60 to 70% of people do not find political leaders to whom they are ready to give their vote and authority for 5 years. This indicates a lack of trust and loyalty to the political authorities.
Якщо такого рівня довіри немає, то можна говорити і про
This applies to both the military and the political leadership, which should represent the interests of society. This indicator should not be lowered. Otherwise, the question of the sustainability of democratic processes in Ukraine will arise. You mentioned a terrible picture, and we can touch on an even more terrible one. We hope it won't come to that. If North Korean soldiers enter the war, the United States may take direct military action. To what extent is this a realistic scenario, given that Putin and Kim Jong-un have agreed on mutual assistance? The use of the army is possible in the event of an attack on their territory. According to South Korean intelligence, North Korean troops will operate in the Kursk region of Russia. There is currently no evidence that North Korean troops are participating in battles on other fronts. It is very important, of course, what this American said. It is extremely important because thanks to our foreigners, we have already had the actions related to the involvement of Korean military personnel interpreted so that we know how to comment on them correctly. They said that Putin is not ready for negotiations, and this would mean that the war has expanded. Thank you. We understand and interpret this perfectly well without you. The question is one of action. Which specific actors are ready to take action and where? Can the U.S. military fight separately, for example, against the North Koreans in the Kursk region when Russians and Ukrainians are fighting on other fronts? Is this even possible in combat operations? It is hard to imagine what kind of threat North Korea poses to the United States. There is none. From South Korea's point of view, as long as North Koreans are sent to Ukraine, they will be destroyed on the battlefield as Russian citizens. Thank God, this means that the threat to our security is weakening. Their indignation and interpretation are in the verbal plane. Ukraine expects that the involvement of a third party in the war is a horizontal escalation that will directly affect the fighting. Give us a symmetrical opportunity to respond. More equipment, more weapons, etc. The Americans are asking, we are already providing assistance, what more do you want? Personal involvement of the military. 10,000 soldiers is about 1/3 of the mobilization of the Russian army, which contracts about 30,000 people a month. So 10 or 12,000 are insignificant numbers for the enemy that have no real consequences. Well, sanctions. Well, what other sanctions can be applied to North Korea if the country has already violated the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in general? The country has developed nuclear weapons. The country is under UN sanctions. What other sanctions can be imposed on it? Sanctions usually restrict trade and economic activities and personal rights, such as a ban on entry and use of accounts. In poor countries where people go to work in China or Russia, there are unlikely to be any offshore accounts opened in Cyprus or the United States. And one day they dream of getting a visa there or moving there like Mexicans. Well, it also looks somehow specific. That's why words and words, from the point of view of the nature of the fighting, where there are several 100,000 soldiers on the Ukrainian side and several 100,000 soldiers on the Russian side, are unlikely to have any impact on the use of this unit. Here is an important point that I discussed once, I think either with you or with Andriana on Channel 24, but it is necessary and possible to emphasize it again. This treaty, which was signed in June or July by Putin and Kim, provided for, well, the very point that Putin referred to. This is point 4, that in the event of an attack, the country provides assistance, including armed forces, and so on. And when they were signing these agreements, they asked whether the relevant clause applies to the situation, say, to the war that Russia has unleashed on the territory of Ukraine, or, let's say, to the ongoing conflict between North and South Korea. I think the answer came from Russia. The Russian side commented that this clause only applies to other conflicts and hostilities that will arise after the signing of the relevant agreement. That is, all of those listed, namely the war on the territory of Ukraine and the war between North and South Korea, which is in a state of freeze, are ongoing. And in fact, they do not change the status quo of the parties at the time of signing. Since then, we have had only one story that made it possible to apply this 4th article or 4th paragraph. This is a story that concerns what the Russians call a counter-terrorist operation to violate their borders in the territory of Kursk. Accordingly, if we stay within the framework of the treaty and consistent legal interpretation of how Putin sees it in his head, for example, the North Koreans will be involved in operations in Kursk. And by doing so, he is also saying, in principle, in the language of diplomacy with our partners across the ocean and with us, that the war's extension beyond the territory of Ukraine creates a new situation, in which, by involving the North Koreans, he is only reaching parity. The escalation took place in terms of the war going beyond the territory of Ukraine. We reciprocated by involving a new entity that had not previously participated. We reciprocated by involving a new entity that had not previously participated. We reciprocated by involving a new entity that had not previously participated. We reciprocated by involving a new entity that had not previously participated. We reciprocated by involving a new entity that had not previously participated. We reciprocated by involving a new entity that had not previously participated. We say that the escalation is caused by the involvement of North Korea, and they, as I explained at the press conference, see the situation in their own way.